the dangerous truth about the rarest personality type on Earth. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Carl Jung once said. And yet, for the rarest personality type on Earth, this journey can be both a gift and a quiet burden. In today's video on spiritual wisdom, we're uncovering the dangerous truth behind this rare psychological makeup, why deep insight, sensitivity, and inner depth can feel isolating in a world that rewards conformity, and how this very difference holds the key to profound personal growth and lasting happiness. As you listen, ask yourself, have you ever felt misunderstood because you see the world too deeply? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us as we explore how understanding this truth can help you live more consciously, authentically, and peacefully in your everyday life. 1. This is an extremely bizarre personality type and is dangerous to a society in a state of slumber. This personality type is considered extremely rare and deeply unsettling to a society that prefers comfort over consciousness, not because these individuals seek conflict, but because their very way of perceiving reality exposes what most people unconsciously avoid. Carl Jung described them as a quiet threat to the status quo due to their highly differentiated consciousness, a level of inner awareness that allows them to see human nature without illusion, to recognize social masks for what they are, and to detect the subtle agreements people make with themselves to remain asleep. While others move through life guided by habit and external validation, these individuals are inwardly oriented, observing patterns beneath behavior, sensing contradictions between words and intentions, and feeling an almost instinctive resistance to collective falsehoods that are treated as normal. From an early age, they often experience a profound sense of dislocation, as if they were placed into a world that operates on a frequency slightly misaligned with their own. This sense of not belonging is not rooted in superiority or rejection of others, but in an acute sensitivity that makes the emotional atmosphere of society feel overwhelming and incoherent. They don't merely notice emotions, they absorb them, often experiencing other people's feelings as a direct internal wave rather than distant information. This heightened receptivity can feel like a burden, especially in environments saturated with noise, competition, and unspoken tension, leaving them drained by interactions that others consider harmless or even energizing. Because they naturally question surface-level explanations, these individuals are frequently labeled by social systems as problematic. Schools, families, and institutions built on conformity tend to view depth as disruption, so they are told they are too intense when they seek meaning, too sensitive when they react to cruelty or dishonesty, and too dangerous when they refuse to accept shallow answers. Over time, these repeated messages can create inner conflict, pushing them to doubt their own perception and suppress their natural instincts in order to survive socially. Yet suppression rarely succeeds for long, because their consciousness is not designed for denial. It is designed for insight. What truly alienates them is not people themselves, but the pervasive superficiality and hypocrisy embedded in modern life. They sense how materialism is often used to numb deeper existential discomfort, how politeness can conceal indifference, and how success is frequently measured by appearance rather than inner coherence. This awareness makes participation in everyday social rituals feel hollow, even threatening, because pretending requires a fragmentation of the self that they instinctively resist. As a result, they may withdraw, not out of fear of connection, but out of a need to preserve inner integrity. This is where spirituality becomes less of a choice and more of a necessity. For such individuals, spirituality is not escapism, but grounding, a way to process the intensity of perception and to contextualize suffering, sensitivity, and solitude within a larger framework of meaning. Their path towards spiritual awakening often begins with confusion and discomfort, followed by disillusionment with societal narratives, and eventually unfolds into clarity. They start to recognize that their difference is not a flaw, but an evolutionary function, a form of consciousness meant to observe, integrate, and illuminate rather than conform. In this sense, what society unconsciously fears is not their presence, but their potential influence. A person who sees clearly cannot be easily manipulated, distracted, or reduced to roles imposed by others. Without preaching or rebelling, they challenge collective sleep simply by existing authentically, embodying a depth that reveals how much of modern life is built on avoidance. Their danger lies not in aggression, but in awareness, because awareness quietly dissolves illusions, and illusions are what keep a sleeping society intact. Do you recognize this truth within yourself? If this message resonates with you, declare it boldly in the comments. I am awake, aware, and unafraid to challenge a sleeping world. 2. This abnormality is not a disease, but a sign of psychological evolution. What Jung calls this so-called abnormality is not an illness to be cured or a defect to be corrected, but a clear sign that the psyche has begun to evolve beyond the ordinary level of awareness. Because when your inner consciousness expands faster than the collective mindset around you, a sense of distance naturally arises between who you are becoming and the social world that once felt familiar. Jung emphasizes that this feeling of social alienation is often misunderstood and mislabeled as depression or social anxiety, when in reality, it reflects a consciousness that has transcended habitual patterns of thinking and emotional reactivity, placing you in a psychological position where surface-level interactions no longer satisfy you, and unconscious social routines begin to feel strangely hollow. As this shift unfolds, you may notice that being around many people feels draining rather than energizing, not because you dislike others, but because your awareness has grown more sensitive to emotional noise, inconsistency, and lack of authenticity. Conversations that revolve around gossip, status, or repetition may leave you feeling empty, and the pressure to conform can feel exhausting rather than comforting, which Jung saw not as a failure to adapt, but as evidence that your inner life has become more complex and inwardly structured. This stage, however, comes with a heavy price, because expanded awareness without understanding can quickly turn into loneliness, mental fatigue, and a sense of disorientation, especially when you have not yet learned how to ground yourself in your own inner values and psychological discipline. Jung warned that higher consciousness exposes what lies beneath the surface, bringing unresolved fears, emotional wounds, and unconscious contradictions into awareness, which can feel overwhelming if you expect growth to be purely uplifting. As he suggested, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this confrontation with the inner shadow is often the most difficult part of the process because it strips away comforting illusions and forces you to see yourself honestly. This is why many people at this stage feel tired not from physical effort, but from constant inner reflection and emotional depth, processing layers of meaning that others rarely pause to examine. Without self-knowledge, this heightened state can feel like being lost without direction, as if your mind is too active and your emotions too intense to find stability. Yet Jung made it clear that the danger lies not in awareness itself, but in the failure to integrate it. When consciousness expands without grounding, a person may drift into isolation, self-doubt, or confusion, mistaking growth for damage and retreating from life instead of learning how to engage it consciously. With understanding, however, this same awareness becomes a source of clarity and inner strength, allowing you to move through the world with discernment rather than withdrawal. This is where spirituality becomes practical rather than abstract, because spiritual development, in Jung's view, is not about escaping human experience, but about inhabiting it more fully and responsibly. As you begin to recognize that your sensitivity and solitude are signals of inner growth rather than personal failure, resistance gives way to acceptance, and acceptance opens the door to mastery. Jung believed that individuation often requires a temporary separation from the collective, not as punishment, but as preparation, allowing you to develop an inner compass strong enough to guide your choices without constant external approval. Over time, as this inner structure strengthens, relationships can return in more authentic forms, based on depth and mutual awareness rather than unconscious attachment. The true danger Jung identified is misunderstanding this stage and rejecting yourself for it. Because when expanded consciousness is met with self-judgment, it becomes destructive. But when it is met with responsibility and insight, it matures into wisdom. In this sense, the experience of alienation is not an endpoint, but a threshold, one that invites you to learn self-mastery, to ground spirituality in lived experience, and to transform spiritual development from a painful awakening into a stable, integrated way of being. 3. 8. Core characteristics of this personality. This personality is defined first by emotional depth that goes far beyond ordinary feeling. Because you do not simply experience emotions, you inhabit them, absorb them, and often carry not only your own inner world, but the emotional undercurrents of those around you, sensing moods, tensions, and unspoken pain on a collective level, which gives you extraordinary empathy, yet also makes you vulnerable to emotional overload if you are not careful. Carl Jung once observed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And you feel this truth deeply because your emotional sensitivity constantly brings you face to face with what others try to escape, forcing you to confront reality rather than hide from it. Alongside this emotional depth is a sharp ability to detect falsehoods, not through logic alone, but through an intuitive awareness of inconsistency, allowing you to sense the difference between who someone pretends to be and what their shadow reveals beneath the surface. You notice subtle shifts in tone, energy, and intention. And even when words sound convincing, something inside you quietly alerts you when a story does not align with truth. This is why shallow charm rarely impresses you, and why you may feel unsettled in environments built on appearances rather than authenticity, because your inner compass is tuned to what is real rather than what is socially acceptable. You also possess an uncompromising tendency to question everything, especially beliefs handed down without examination, as you are not satisfied with answers that merely repeat tradition or popular opinion. You keep asking why until meaning emerges, and this relentless inquiry can make others uncomfortable, not because you are confrontational, but because your presence challenges borrowed certainty. Jung believed that thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. And you instinctively resist judgment in favor of understanding, even when that path feels lonely or demanding. This questioning nature is closely tied to a powerful independence, often expressed through an archetypal need to remain true to yourself at all costs, where solitude feels preferable to connection that requires self-betrayal. You would rather walk alone than compromise your inner integrity, not because you reject others, but because losing your authentic self feels far more painful than temporary isolation. This independence can appear obsessive or extreme from the outside, yet it is rooted in a deep respect for truth and selfhood that refuses to be negotiated away for comfort or approval. Your intuition operates at an unusually high level, processing information unconsciously with remarkable speed, allowing you to anticipate patterns, outcomes, and emotional shifts long before they become visible. You may not always know how you know, but your insights often arrive fully formed, like quiet certainties rather than loud conclusions. And when you ignore them, life has a way of reminding you why they mattered. This intuitive intelligence reflects Carl Jung's insight that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and when honored, it becomes a guiding force rather than a source of confusion or anxiety. At the core of this personality lies a profound hunger for meaning, making it impossible for you to thrive in a life that feels empty, artificial, or disconnected from purpose. You cannot survive on routine alone, status alone, or pleasure alone, because your inner world demands significance, coherence, and alignment between values and action. When meaning is absent, you do not merely feel bored. You feel spiritually depleted, as though something essential to your being has been starved. Because of this need for meaning, your life is marked by constant transformation, where periods of growth are often followed by shedding old identities, environments, and relationships that no longer resonate with who you are becoming. You outgrow spaces quickly, not because you are unstable, but because stagnation feels like a slow erosion of the soul. Jung described this process as individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming oneself, and your repeated cycles of change reflect a deep commitment to inner truth rather than external permanence. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of this personality is your transformative presence, because simply being yourself can unintentionally trigger discomfort, awakening, or even emotional pain in others. You reflect people back to themselves, exposing contradictions, suppressed emotions, and unresolved wounds. And while some find healing through this mirror, others experience it as threat or intrusion. This is not because you seek to change anyone, but because your authenticity makes denial harder to maintain, reminding others of parts of themselves they have avoided. As we uncover the 8 core characteristics of this rare personality, take a moment to reflect on how deeply this truth resonates with you. If you feel this wisdom awakening something within, affirm it in the comments by writing, "I recognize the depth of who I am." 4. Why are they dangerous? 3 destructive shadows. When individuals of this rare personality type fail to integrate their shadow, their greatest gift quietly turns against them, revealing itself through 3 destructive inner patterns that often unfold without conscious awareness. The first is the shadow of inflation, which arises almost automatically because these individuals perceive far more than most people do. They notice subtle emotional shifts, hidden motives, unspoken tensions, and long-term patterns that others overlook. And over time, this heightened perception can create an invisible sense of elevation. It does not begin as arrogance, but as certainty that one sees more clearly, understands more deeply, and operates on a level others cannot reach. In the language of spirituality, this can feel like insight or awakening. Yet without grounding, it slowly hardens into psychological distance. As Carl Jung warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because inflation allows insight without self-confrontation. When perception is not balanced by humility, the individual may unconsciously withdraw from others, feeling misunderstood, superior, or alone, while those around them sense judgment or emotional coldness. This shadow is dangerous because it transforms awareness into identity, turning sensitivity into separation and wisdom into isolation. Closely connected to inflation is the shadow of martyrdom, which often develops when deep perception meets unguarded compassion. Because these individuals sense pain quickly and accurately, they feel compelled to relieve it, believing it is their responsibility to heal, guide, or rescue others. They give their time, energy, emotional presence, and understanding far beyond healthy limits, often without being asked and without receiving reciprocity. On the surface, this looks like kindness, service, or moral strength. But underneath it hides exhaustion, suppressed resentment, and a subtle need to be needed. In spirituality and spiritual awakening, martyrdom is especially seductive because sacrifice is often praised. Yet Jung reminded us that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. When sacrifice replaces self-honesty, the individual avoids their own unmet needs by carrying the weight of others. Over time, the body and psyche rebel through burnout, emotional numbness, or bitterness, and the person who once wanted to save the world feels quietly depleted by it. The third destructive pattern is the shadow of paralysis, which emerges when insight becomes excessive and action becomes delayed. These individuals tend to analyze everything: their emotions, their motives, other people's reactions, future outcomes, and potential risks until life itself becomes a mental process rather than a lived experience. They remain trapped in reflection, waiting for certainty that never arrives, mistaking constant understanding for progress. This shadow is particularly powerful during spiritual awakening, when awareness expands faster than embodiment. The mind becomes a refuge, but also a prison, as choices are postponed, opportunities pass, and inner knowing remains theoretical rather than lived. Jung's observation that thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge, takes a darker turn here. Overthinking becomes a way to avoid movement, vulnerability, and responsibility. The danger of paralysis lies not in inaction alone, but in the slow erosion of confidence and vitality as life is endlessly contemplated instead of engaged. What makes these shadows truly destructive is how seamlessly they reinforce one another. Inflation separates the individual from others. Martyrdom drains their energy in the name of connection, and paralysis prevents them from building a grounded, embodied life of their own. Together, they keep the individual suspended between insight and exhaustion, awareness and stagnation. In the deeper work of spirituality, integration means allowing perception to serve compassion rather than superiority, allowing compassion to exist with boundaries rather than self-erasure, and allowing understanding to move into action rather than endless contemplation. Without this integration, the rarest personality type does not become powerful. It becomes fragile, burdened by gifts that were never meant to be carried alone. If this resonates with you, leave a comment below. I am brave enough to face my shadow. Let that be your marker of growth as we continue this journey into deeper psychological and spiritual wisdom. 5. Their true role in the world. Jung understood their true role in the world as something both necessary and unsettling, because he did not see them as accidental outsiders or misunderstood idealists, but as what he powerfully called the immune system of collective consciousness. In his view, you emerge at moments when society drifts into unconsciousness, when systems harden, empathy fades, and human beings begin to function more like mechanisms than living souls. You are not here to blend smoothly into such conditions, because your inner structure reacts to imbalance the way a body reacts to disease. You sense when something is wrong long before it becomes visible, and that sensitivity places you in direct tension with environments that prefer comfort over truth. This is why your presence often feels disruptive, not because you intend to provoke, but because awareness itself exposes what has been ignored for too long. Jung believed you were never meant to live easily, because an easy life would require you to numb the very awareness that defines you. Instead, you were meant to live meaningfully, and meaning, by its nature, demands engagement with difficulty. Living meaningfully means asking questions that others avoid, questions about power, morality, identity, and purpose, questions that unsettle routines and challenge collective agreements built on convenience rather than conscience. When you ask these questions, you are often met with resistance, dismissal, or misunderstanding, not because the questions lack value, but because they threaten the stability of unconscious systems. In this way, your life becomes a quiet confrontation with complacency, where simply staying honest to your inner compass already feels radical. As society becomes more rigid and inhumane, you feel this pressure more intensely, because your inner world remains sensitive to suffering, contradiction, and falsehood. You cannot easily accept shallow definitions of success, relationships based on utility, or values that ignore inner life. And this refusal is not rebellion for its own sake, but a natural consequence of your psychological depth. Jung recognized that this depth almost inevitably draws you towards spirituality, not as a belief system to escape reality, but as a framework to endure it without losing yourself. Spirituality, for you, becomes a grounding force that helps you integrate insight, pain, and responsibility into something coherent rather than overwhelming. Without genuine spiritual development, Jung warned that individuals like you risk becoming fragmented, cynical, or exhausted by the weight of what they perceive. Awareness without integration leads to burnout, but awareness supported by spiritual development becomes wisdom. Through inner work, reflection, and ethical self-examination, you learn to hold contradictions without collapsing, to see darkness without becoming consumed by it, and to remain humane in environments that reward detachment. This is not a passive process. It is an ongoing discipline that shapes your character from the inside out, allowing you to carry insight without arrogance and compassion without self-sacrifice. Your role, then, is not to dominate society or impose truth, but to function as a signal and a corrective presence. Jung saw you as a bridge between what is and what could be, someone whose very existence challenges stagnation simply by embodying awareness, integrity, and depth. This role often feels lonely because it places you at the edge of collective norms. Yet it is also profoundly purposeful. Many of the most meaningful shifts in human consciousness did not begin with mass movements, but with individuals who quietly refused to betray their inner truth, even when doing so came at a personal cost. When individuals like you suppress this role in order to fit in, Jung believed society loses a crucial balancing force and becomes more vulnerable to cruelty and unconscious repetition. But when you accept your nature, even without recognition or reward, you contribute to collective healing in subtle but essential ways. Your struggles are not evidence of failure. They are signs that you are engaging with life at a deeper level than comfort alone would allow. The core lesson is not to seek validation from a world that resists awareness, but to understand that your questioning nature is meaningful, that your sensitivity has purpose, and that committing to spirituality and spiritual development is not optional for you, but necessary to transform insight into wisdom and difficulty into contribution. 6. The final evolutionary step, fully accepting their true nature. The final evolutionary step for the rarest personality type is not about becoming more acceptable, more agreeable, or more easily understood by the world, but about fully accepting your true nature without dilution or apology, which means you stop dimming your light to protect other people's comfort and stop translating the depth of your soul into shallow language just to avoid being seen as too much. When you do this for too long, something subtle but dangerous happens. You begin to live automatically, moving through life on habit rather than intention, performing versions of yourself that are socially rewarded but spiritually empty. As Carl Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And for rare personalities, this avoidance often takes the form of self-betrayal disguised as adaptation, where you tell yourself you are being flexible, mature, or humble, while in reality, you are slowly disconnecting from your inner truth and losing the vitality that once made you feel alive. This is why the work at this stage is not self-improvement, but self-alignment, because your task is no longer to adjust yourself to the environment, but to consciously choose environments that do not require you to shrink. Finding the right community becomes essential, not as a source of validation, but as a space where your depth does not need to be defended or explained. The right people do not drain your energy by demanding constant translation of your inner world. Instead, they create a quiet sense of recognition that allows you to speak from your core without fear. Without this, even the strongest inner light becomes exhausted, because depth cannot survive long in places that only value speed, surface, and performance. And as the saying goes, A diamond does not shine in a room that only appreciates glass. Equally important is learning to protect your energy, because sensitivity at this level is not fragility, it is precision. Every environment, conversation, and obligation either strengthens your inner coherence or fractures it. And when you ignore this, you begin to confuse constant tension with normal life. Energy protection does not mean withdrawal from the world, but discernment within it, knowing when to engage and when to step back, when to speak, and when silence preserves your power. Jung himself observed, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." And this kind of loneliness often arises not from isolation, but from overexposure to spaces that cannot meet you where you are. At this stage, acceptance must become practical, because inner insight without real-world expression turns into restlessness rather than wisdom. Realizing a practical vision means giving your depth a form it can live through, whether that is creative work, teaching, service, leadership, or a disciplined personal practice that anchors your intuition in action. When you stop going automatic with yourself and begin acting from conscious intention, your life starts to feel internally unified rather than fragmented. And confidence emerges not from external approval, but from inner consistency. This is where spiritual wisdom becomes embodied rather than theoretical, where knowing who you are finally aligns with how you live, and where the rarest personality type becomes dangerous, not because it seeks power, but because it no longer abandons itself to survive. In conclusion, the dangerous truth about the rarest personality type is not that they are broken or disconnected from the world, but that they see too deeply, feel too intensely, and live too consciously for a society built on noise and surface-level thinking. As Carl Jung taught, true individuality often comes with isolation, inner tension, and the responsibility to live in alignment with one's authentic self rather than external expectations. If this message resonated with you, it may be a reminder that your depth is not a flaw, but a calling to cultivate self-awareness, protect your energy, and transform insight into wisdom. If you found value in this reflection, please like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom for more Jung-inspired insights. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos on self-discovery, depth, and inner transformation. The real reason you became a loner, it's not what you think. Loneliness does not come from having no people around one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Carl Jung famously made this distinction, and it may hold the key to why you feel different from the crowd. If you have found yourself pulling away from society lately, it isn't because you are broken, and it isn't simply because you are antisocial. It is often a sign of a profound internal shift, a necessary step toward what Jung called individuation. You are not just isolating, you are incubating. In this video, we are going to uncover the spiritual necessity of your solitude and how to use this time to build a self that is unshakable. Before we begin, if you believe that your solitude is a strength, not a weakness, please like this video and comment, "I am finding myself," below. Let us journey into the wisdom of the introverted soul. 1. Loners are not born. They are conditioned in childhood. Loners are not shaped by personality labels or simple introversion. They are shaped by repeated emotional neglect in childhood, often so subtle that no one notices it while it is happening. A child does not suddenly decide to withdraw from the world for no reason. The withdrawal slowly forms when emotional needs are overlooked again and again, when feelings are minimized, when questions go unanswered, when attention is inconsistent, and when love feels conditional. In these quiet moments, the child learns a powerful lesson without anyone ever saying it out loud. Needing too much is dangerous, expressing emotions is unsafe, and relying on others leads to disappointment. Over time, the child adapts by turning inward, creating an inner world that feels more stable than the outside one. What looks like independence from the outside is often a nervous system trained to survive without emotional support. This is where the roots of the loner identity truly begin. As this pattern repeats, the child becomes unusually observant and emotionally alert. They begin to read the moods of adults, sense shifts in energy, and adjust their behavior to avoid conflict or rejection. They learn to be quiet, agreeable, and self-reliant, not because it is their nature, but because it is what keeps them emotionally safe. Praise often comes not for authenticity, but for being easy, mature, or low maintenance. Slowly, connection starts to feel unpredictable, while solitude feels controlled and safe. This is why many loners grow into adults who can move through social spaces smoothly while still feeling detached inside. They may be surrounded by people, yet feel emotionally alone. According to Carl Jung's psychological insight, this creates a shadow pattern. The belief that intimacy leads to loss, that vulnerability invites pain, and that the self must always handle life alone. Yet within this shadow also lies hidden spiritual strength, because enduring emotional absence trains the soul to turn inward in search of meaning. This inward turn often opens the door to spirituality and spiritual awakening, not through comfort, but through longing. Many loners discover meaning through silence, reflection, and solitude long before they ever name it as a spiritual path. While others bond through shared activities or external validation, the loner bonds with their inner world. They ask deep questions early in life. They notice the emotional undercurrents others ignore. They become deeply intuitive, sensitive to energy, and aware of invisible emotional dynamics. However, this sensitivity is a double-edged sword. The same awareness that grants depth also keeps the nervous system on constant alert. Crowds feel overwhelming. Shallow conversations feel draining, and emotional chaos in others feels physically exhausting. Distance becomes not a rejection of people, but a method of self-regulation. Alone time becomes the only place where the body finally relaxes. As adulthood unfolds, the original childhood conditioning continues to shape relationships. The loner may crave connection deeply, yet unconsciously expect abandonment. They may be drawn to emotionally unavailable people because that dynamic feels familiar. They may struggle to ask for help, even when they are exhausted, because the nervous system learned long ago that help does not reliably come. From a Jungian perspective, this creates an ongoing conflict between the persona that appears strong and independent and the inner child that still longs to be seen and emotionally met. Spiritual awakening often begins when this conflict becomes impossible to ignore. Patterns repeat until awareness breaks the cycle. At that point, solitude no longer serves only as protection. It becomes a space of healing, self-listening, and gradual reprogramming of old emotional beliefs. The loner starts to realize that being alone was never proof of unworthiness. It was proof of adaptation. What once developed for survival can slowly transform into conscious solitude, where isolation is no longer rooted in fear, but in self-connection, clarity, and the gentle rebuilding of trust with the world. Comment below. I am healing my inner child. If you're ready to understand your past and step into a stronger, more conscious version of yourself. 2. Emotional needs were rejected, dismissed, or ignored. As a child, you tried to express fear, excitement, sadness, or confusion in the only way you knew how, through your emotions, and instead of being met with understanding, you were told, "You're fine, stop being sensitive," or worse, you were simply ignored. And in those moments, something profound happened inside you that no one noticed, because each dismissal quietly taught you that your inner world was not welcome, that what you felt was somehow wrong, excessive, or inconvenient. And over time, this repeated experience shaped your nervous system to believe that emotions were unsafe to share, that vulnerability was risky, and that being open invited rejection rather than connection. Little by little, you learned to pull your feelings inward, not because you lacked them, but because you were protecting them. And this inner withdrawal became a form of self-preservation long before it ever became a personality trait. And while others learned to process emotions through support and reassurance, you learned to process them alone, in silence, in your own private space, teaching yourself to survive without emotional mirrors, without validation, without anyone explaining that what you felt made sense. And this is how loneliness begins, not as a choice, but as a strategy the soul uses when it realizes no one is coming to meet it where it is. What makes this experience so powerful is that it does not just shape how you relate to people, it reshapes how you relate to yourself. Because when you grow up, learning that your emotions are too much or not important, you begin to question your own inner truth, second-guess your reactions, and minimize your needs. And yet at the same time, you develop an unusually deep inner awareness. Because when your outer world does not reflect you, you are forced to turn inward to understand yourself. And this inward turning is often the first quiet step towards spirituality and spiritual development, even if you did not have the language for it at the time. You did not become distant because you lacked the ability to care. You became distant because you cared deeply in an environment that could not hold that depth. And so your sensitivity learned to armor itself. Your openness learned to observe before it trusted. And your heart learned to stay guarded until safety was proven rather than promised. And this is why solitude can feel comforting rather than empty to you. Because it was the place where you were never told to shrink, where your emotions did not have to explain themselves, and where your inner world could exist without interruption or judgment. And yet the deeper truth is that this pattern does not exist to trap you in isolation forever, but to awaken you to the hidden intelligence within your emotional life. Because once you recognize that your loneliness was formed through emotional neglect rather than personal failure, something begins to shift, and your silence stops feeling like a flaw and starts revealing itself as a space of awareness, perception, and transformation. A space where you no longer run from your feelings, but begin to understand them as guides, teachers, and signals guiding your spiritual development back toward wholeness. 3. Vulnerability became associated with danger. Vulnerability became associated with danger long before you ever chose to be alone. Each time you opened your heart and were met with shame, mockery, silence, punishment, or emotional betrayal, your nervous system quietly rewrote its rules for survival until one unspoken belief settled deep into your body. People are unsafe. Solitude is safety. You did not learn this through logic or conscious choice, but through repeated emotional experience, through moments when being seen felt more dangerous than being invisible, and being open felt more painful than being closed. Over time, your system did not just remember the fear, it organized your entire sense of safety around it, teaching you to relax only when no one could hurt you. This is why being alone may now feel calm, regulated, even empowering, while being emotionally close to others can trigger tension, hypervigilance, or quiet withdrawal. It is not because you are antisocial or broken, but because your body learned that solitude meant control and protection, while connection meant unpredictability and emotional risk. Carl Jung captured this truth when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And for a long time, your preference for being a loner may have felt like personality when it was actually a survival pattern. What once protected you gradually became part of your identity, shifting from "I learned to be alone to survive" into "this is just who I am." Yet beneath this self-image lies the emotional intelligence that helped you adapt. Your solitude is not emptiness. It is a refuge built by experience. The problem arises not because you value being alone, but because the choice was once driven by fear instead of freedom. Over time, this protective structure can quietly limit your ability to receive care, closeness, and emotional nourishment, even as you pride yourself on independence. What looks like strength from the outside can sometimes be emotional self-containment on the inside, where needing nothing from anyone feels safer than risking disappointment again. As spiritual wisdom teaches, true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to hold it without collapsing. Jung's work reminds us that what we repress does not vanish. It waits in the shadow and shapes our behavior from behind the scenes. Your loneliness, then, is not random. It is meaningful. It carries memory. It tells the story of what you learned about love, trust, and emotional safety when you were still forming your sense of the world. And yet the same mechanism that once saved you can now become the very barrier that separates you from deeper connection. As Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And this means the place where you learn to close yourself off is also where awareness, healing, and transformation begin. Through the lens of Carl Jung and spiritual wisdom, you begin to see that your nervous system is not your enemy. It is simply loyal to old information. It learned to equate safety with isolation because, at one time, that equation kept you emotionally alive. But safety does not have to mean solitude forever, and connection does not have to mean danger. The shift begins when you stop judging your loneliness and start listening to it. When you acknowledge that your tendency to walk alone was never weakness, but an intelligent response to emotional threat. In that realization, you reclaim your story, not as a person who is broken, but as someone who protected something sacred inside, something that may now be ready, slowly and on its own terms, to be felt, trusted, and shared again. Are you ready to release the fear around vulnerability and step into true inner strength? If so, comment below. I choose to feel safe. To mark your commitment to this journey of healing and self-discovery. 4. Self-reliance replaced human connection. After hundreds of small emotional rejections that never seemed dramatic enough to be called trauma, the child slowly stops reaching outward, not because they stop needing connection, but because each attempt quietly teaches them that needing others brings disappointment. These moments are subtle missed comfort, ignored feelings, unmet reassurance, but their accumulation reshapes the inner world. What once reached for warmth now turns inward for survival. Learning instead how to self-soothe, how to carry pain alone, and how to depend only on the self. This is where the loner identity is not chosen, but formed quietly and unconsciously as protection. What looks like strength from the outside is often built from emotional necessity on the inside. Self-reliance does not emerge because the child is naturally independent, but because connection becomes unreliable. When vulnerability is repeatedly met with distance, the nervous system adapts, teaching the child that it is safer not to ask, safer not to lean, safer not to hope. Over time, independence becomes automatic rather than intentional, and emotional withdrawal becomes a learned language of safety rather than a personality trait. As Carl Jung warned, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. And without realizing it, many children inherit emotional scarcity rather than emotional guidance. They grow up believing they must regulate their fear, sadness, and confusion alone because no one else consistently does it with them. This is how self-soothing replaces human connection, not as growth, but as compensation. The child does not become emotionally numb. Rather, they become emotionally private, retreating into an inner world that feels more stable than unpredictable relationships. In adulthood, this survival pattern is often misunderstood as introversion, emotional detachment, or mysterious independence. Yet under the surface, the former child still longs for deep connection while fearing its instability. They may crave intimacy, but feel uneasy when it arrives, wanting closeness, yet bracing for disappointment. This inner conflict becomes part of their identity, strong enough to stand alone, but still silently desiring to be met. It is here that spirituality and spiritual awakening often begin to emerge, not through comfort, but through solitude that forces honest self-examination. Because connection was once unsafe, awareness becomes heightened. Loners often develop deep sensitivity to emotional shifts, tone, and subtle psychological undercurrents. They learn to read rooms, moods, and energies because their safety once depended on it. This sensitivity, born from emotional vigilance, later becomes intuition, introspection, and a natural pull towards spiritual wisdom. What began as emotional armor slowly transforms into inner perception. The independent identity continues to shape relationships, often unconsciously. The loner gives deeply, yet hesitates to receive freely. They love sincerely, yet keep part of themselves guarded. Even when connection is offered, the old pattern whispers that dependence leads to loss. Jung's insight becomes clear here. What is not healed remains active in the shadow. The early training in emotional self-sufficiency does not vanish with age. It simply changes form. Yet within this pattern lies the doorway to transformation. Solitude, once a shield, becomes a mirror. The same self-reliance that replaced human connection becomes the foundation for inner sovereignty. Through reflection, self-trust, and conscious awareness, isolation shifts from defense to discernment. What once formed from emotional absence evolves into inner presence, and the individual begins to see that the loner identity was never a personality flaw, but an adaptive response to emotional scarcity, one that now holds the potential for true spiritual awakening rather than quiet survival. 5. Loners become hyper-observers as a survival skill. Growing up in an emotionally unpredictable environment trains you to become a hyper-observer without you ever choosing it consciously. You learn to read moods, micro-expressions, subtle energy shifts, and emotional danger with astonishing accuracy, not out of curiosity, but because, as the truth states, this is not curiosity, it is a defense mechanism. Your nervous system learns that safety depends on awareness, so you scan faces, tones, silences, and reactions instinctively. You walk into a room and feel tension before anyone speaks. You sense when a smile is forced. You notice when the emotional temperature suddenly changes. While others move through conversations casually, you remain alert, quietly tracking everything. What looks like calm observation on the outside is, on the inside, the residue of a childhood where emotional stability was never guaranteed, and vigilance became the price of safety. Over time, this survival skill follows you into adulthood and begins to shape your identity, your relationships, and even your connection to spirituality and spiritual development. You may withdraw, not because you dislike people, but because solitude is the only place where your nervous system fully rests. You may struggle to trust easily, not from arrogance or coldness, but from the deep instinct to protect your inner world before it can be harmed again. This heightened awareness gives you the rare ability to see beneath appearances, yet it also carries the burden of emotional exhaustion. You are always sensing, always reading, always interpreting. Without realizing it, you may begin to believe that being alone is who you are, when in fact, it is simply how you learn to survive. Through Carl Jung's spiritual wisdom, this pattern reflects the shadow of sensitivity, an unconscious adaptation that once protected you but no longer needs to dominate your life. As your spiritual development deepens, the meaning of this hyper-observation begins to change. What once existed as fear-based scanning can evolve into conscious awareness, discernment, and presence. You begin to understand that your perception is not meant to imprison you in isolation, but to refine your ability to navigate life with clarity rather than constant defense. You start to see the difference between intuition and survival-driven alertness, between healthy solitude and emotional withdrawal. In this awareness, healing becomes possible not by destroying the part of you that learned to observe, but by releasing the fear that taught it to stay on guard. The skill that once kept you safe can now serve your growth, allowing your sensitivity to become a strength guided by choice rather than a reflex ruled by the past. Do you recognize this trait in yourself? Comment with awareness. I see clearly, and I trust my inner vision. 6. The good child. Pattern leads to adult burnout. Many people who grow into loners were once the good child, the quiet peacekeeper who learned too early how to stay out of the way, how to manage emotions instead of expressing them, and how to be low maintenance so they would not become a burden. They were praised for being mature, responsible, and understanding. But what was really happening was emotional self-erasure. As Carl Jung warned, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. And for many future loners, that burden became invisible training in emotional survival rather than emotional freedom. As they grow into adulthood, that early pattern transforms into a life of chronic overgiving. You may find yourself giving more time, more care, more patience, and more emotional energy than the people around you ever return. You become the listener, the supporter, the problem solver, the one who holds everything together while quietly running on empty. The imbalance feels normal at first because it mirrors what you learned in childhood. But over time, it creates exhaustion, resentment, and emotional burnout. Relationships begin to feel one-sided, not because you are weak, but because your empathy has been conditioned to flow outward without limits. Eventually, solitude becomes less about isolation and more about survival. You step back, not because you dislike people, but because you are tired of being drained. This is where spiritual wisdom begins to reveal what psychology alone cannot fully explain. You are not avoiding connection. You are protecting your nervous system, your energy, and your inner stability. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And when awareness arrives, you finally see that your loneliness was not random. It was a response to years of emotional overexertion and unspoken responsibility. With this awareness comes a quiet but powerful shift. You begin to realize that constantly being the good one has costs, and that true connection cannot exist where self-abandonment is required. Solitude becomes a place of recalibration rather than punishment. It allows you to stop bleeding for people who would never bleed for you, to stop over-explaining your boundaries, and to stop feeling guilty for choosing rest instead of sacrifice. Slowly, your energy returns. Your mind grows clearer. Your intuition sharpens. Your identity begins to detach from the role you were trained to play and reshapes into something more authentic. This is why so many loners resonate deeply with Carl Jung's teachings and with spiritual wisdom as a whole. What once felt like rejection reveals itself as discernment. What once felt like isolation transforms into selective connection. You no longer give from obligation, but from choice. You no longer shrink to keep the peace, but learn to let peace exist within you. The path of the loner, seen clearly, is not a path of emotional coldness. It is the slow, quiet return to the self after years of carrying what was never meant to be yours. 7. Solitude is not loneliness. It is a conscious choice. Loners do not withdraw from the world because they hate people. They withdraw because being surrounded by emotionally unavailable people feels far lonelier than standing alone. After too many moments of speaking and not being heard, of caring and not being met with the same depth, the heart learns a quiet truth. Constant misconnection hurts more than silence. In that realization, solitude slowly transforms from something painful into something protective. It becomes peace instead of pressure, control instead of chaos, and safety instead of constant emotional risk. When you repeatedly find yourself as the one who listens, understands, and holds space, yet never receives the same emotional presence in return. Your nervous system begins to associate connection with exhaustion rather than nourishment. Each shallow conversation, each dismissed feeling, each moment where your vulnerability is met with discomfort or indifference teaches your soul that not every gathering is a place of belonging. Over time, your body reacts before your mind does, tightening in crowded spaces, longing for quiet, not because you fear people, but because you crave emotional honesty. In solitude, something profound begins to happen. Without the noise of other people's expectations, you can finally hear your own inner voice. Without the pressure to perform, explain, or shrink yourself, you start to feel what is real inside you. This is where spirituality quietly deepens, not through grand rituals, but through the simple act of returning to yourself. Here, your loneliness begins to shift into spiritual awakening, because for the first time, you are no longer abandoning your inner world just to avoid being alone on the outside. Being alone allows you to observe your emotions without judgment. You notice how grief rises and falls, how anger dissolves when it is finally acknowledged, how longing teaches you what kind of connection your soul truly seeks. You stop confusing attention with love and proximity with intimacy. You realize that real connection requires emotional presence, not just shared space. In this way, solitude becomes a training ground for emotional clarity and self-respect. Choosing to walk alone for a season is not a rejection of humanity. It is a refusal to keep betraying yourself. It is understanding that healing cannot happen in spaces that constantly reopen old wounds. When you step back, you are not running away from connection. You are stepping out of patterns that taught you to accept emotional crumbs instead of genuine nourishment. You learn that being alone does not make you empty. Staying where you are, unseen, does. As your awareness sharpens, you become more selective. You no longer chase belonging at the cost of your peace. Instead, you start to recognize energy, depth, and sincerity. You learn the difference between people whose presence feels like grounding and those whose presence feels like turbulence. Through this discernment, your boundaries strengthen, your intuition becomes louder, and your self-trust grows steadier. What once looked like isolation reveals itself as a transition. The loner is not broken. The loner is in between worlds, between who they were when they tolerated emotional neglect and who they are becoming through truth and clarity. In this space between, solitude serves as both shelter and mirror, helping you remember who you are when no one is watching, and teaching you that peace is not found in numbers, but in alignment. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more spiritual wisdom like this. And if choosing solitude has empowered you, comment below. I honor my path of conscious solitude. 8. Being a loner is survival intelligence, not a flaw. Being a loner is not a flaw, but a form of survival intelligence shaped by early learned emotional sovereignty. The quiet inner knowing that you do not need to chase connection blindly, depend on others to feel whole, or abandon yourself just to be accepted. You understand intuitively that not every connection nourishes the soul, that some relationships drain more than they give, and so you choose depth over chaos, alignment over approval, and truth over temporary comfort. This is a strength that forms when you realize early in life that belonging is meaningless if it requires self-betrayal. And that wholeness is not something another person can hand you. It is something you construct from the inside out through clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. Because of this, your solitude becomes a place of restoration rather than punishment, a space where your identity forms without noise, where your values sharpen without pressure, and where your inner voice grows louder than the expectations of others. Your path teaches you to read energy more than words and intention more than appearance. And this sensitivity allows you to move through the world with quiet accuracy, understanding quickly who is safe, who is chaotic, and who only wants to take more than they give. You do not isolate because you dislike people. You step back because you sense the emotional cost of staying in the wrong environments, and you choose peace even when others misunderstand your distance. This is emotional sovereignty in action, the ability to regulate your own feelings, hold your own ground, and remain whole even when the world around you feels unstable. Through this, your spirituality deepens because solitude becomes the gateway to self-awareness, intuition, and inner strength, guiding you towards spiritual development that grows naturally when you are no longer dependent on external validation. As you walk this path, your experiences teach you the power of self-protection without fear, self-connection without loneliness, and self-respect without compromise. Your quiet independence is not the result of coldness, but the result of having learned too young what it feels like to carry yourself when no one else could. It is the wisdom of someone who knows that emotional safety is more valuable than social approval. And the more you grow, the more you realize that this way of being has given you 3 essential truths: that choosing yourself is not selfish, but sacred. That true connection only begins when you meet others from a place of wholeness rather than need. And that emotional sovereignty is the foundation upon which real peace is built. Through these lessons, your solitude becomes not a wound, but a source of power proof that you have learned to survive, evolve, and rise without losing yourself. To conclude, do not fear your time alone. While society calls it loneliness, wisdom recognizes it as freedom. By withdrawing from the noise of the collective, you are giving yourself the space to hear your own intuition and integrate your shadow. You are not separated from the world. You are simply becoming whole within it. Support our mission by liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Please subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom and turn on notifications to join us for more deep dives into the human psyche. Thank you for being here,